My daughter chose a new father after my wife left me. She ignored me for 10 years until she needed help. I was married for 8 years. My wife and I had a daughter together, and I thought things were fine. Not perfect, but fine. Then one day, out of nowhere, she told me she'd been cheating on me. She didn't even try to hide it or soften the blow. She just sat me down at the kitchen table and said it plain as day, she'd been with another guy for months. No apologies, no regrets, just the facts. I sat there stunned, while she kept talking. She said she was leaving me and taking our daughter with her. That was the first punch to the gut. It got worse. She told me our daughter, 6 years old at the time, already knew this other guy. Apparently, she'd been around him enough to get comfortable. My wife said our daughter had started calling him Dad, and liked his house better than ours. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My little girl, the one I'd raised since she was a baby, had already replaced me. My wife made it sound like it was no big deal, like this was just how things were now. I didn't yell or fight. I just nodded and let it sink in. We were done. The breakup happened fast. She packed her stuff, took our daughter, and left within a week. I didn't drag it out with lawyers or custody battles. I figured if she wanted to go, there was no point in forcing her to stay. I signed the papers, and that was it. They moved in with this guy, some rich dude with a big house, and I was left alone in our old place. I kept thinking about what she said, about my daughter calling him Dad. It hurt more than the cheating. Way more. I tried to stay in my daughter's life after that. She was still little, and I thought maybe I could keep some kind of connection. I'd call to check in, offer to take her for weekends, but it was clear early on she didn't care. She barely talked to me on the phone, and when I did see her, she just asked when she could go back to Dad's house. That's what she called it. His house was Dad's house, and I was just some guy she used to know. I'd drive her back after those visits, and every time, it felt like a piece of me was getting chipped away. After the divorce, I didn't give up right away. My daughter was still young, and I told myself kids don't really understand what's going on. I figured if I kept showing up, she'd eventually warm up to me again. I'd call her mom to set up visits, short stuff like ice cream trips or a day at the park. Half the time, my ex would say she was busy, and the other half, I'd get a couple hours with her. But those hours were rough. She'd sit there, quiet, barely looking at me. I'd ask about school or her friends, and she'd give one-word answers. Then she'd start talking about Dad, the new guy, and how he took her to cool places or bought her stuff. I'd force a smile and nod, but inside, it was killing me. It didn't take long for me to realize she'd fully switched teams. One day, I picked her up for a weekend, and she slipped up and called me by my first name instead of Dad. I corrected her, gently, and she just shrugged. She said she only called the other guy Dad now because that's what felt right. She was 7 years old, and she'd already made up her mind. I drove her back that day and didn't say much. When I dropped her off, she ran inside without even a goodbye. I sat in my car for a while after that, staring at the steering wheel, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I kept trying for a couple more years. Birthdays, holidays, I'd send gifts, call, show up when I could. Her mom never stopped me, but she didn't help either. She'd just say, "It's up to her," and leave it at that. My daughter's interest in me faded more every time. By the time she was 9, she'd stopped pretending to care. I'd show up, and she'd barely look up from her phone. I'd ask her questions, and she'd sigh like I was annoying her. The new guy's house was big, fancy, full of stuff I couldn't compete with. I had a decent job, but I wasn't rich. I started wondering if that's why she picked him over me. Eventually, I scaled back. Not because I wanted to, but because it hurt too much to keep pushing. I'd still send cards or little gifts, but the visits stopped. I told myself I'd wait until she was older, maybe a teenager, when she might see things differently. That was the plan, anyway. I didn't know then that it'd be a decade before I'd hear from her again. The years after I stopped pushing to see my daughter were empty at first. I'd come home from work, sit in my quiet house, and think about how things used to be. I missed her laugh, the way she'd run around the backyard when she was little. But that was gone, and I had to deal with it. I wasn't the type to wallow forever, so I started focusing on myself. Got a better job, fixed up the house, tried to move on. It wasn't easy, but it was something. Then I met Sarah. She was a coworker, quiet but kind, and we hit it off over coffee one day. She'd been through her own mess, a bad breakup, no kids, and we bonded over that. We started dating, nothing rushed, just casual at first. I told her about my ex and my daughter early on. Didn't want to hide it. She listened, didn't judge, and that was enough for me. After a couple years, we got married. Simple ceremony, no big fuss. I was 38 by then, starting over. We had kids pretty quick, 2 boys, a year apart. They changed everything. The house got loud again, full of toys and chaos. I threw myself into being a dad. Taught them to ride bikes, helped with homework, took them camping. It was good. Really good. Sarah was solid too, she kept us all grounded. I look at my boys sometimes and feel this mix of pride and relief. I hadn't screwed it up this time. They called me Dad, without hesitation, and it felt like I'd gotten a second chance. But my daughter was always in the back of my mind. I'd wonder how she was doing, what she looked like now, if she ever thought about me. I didn't reach out much, maybe a birthday text or a Christmas card, but I never stopped hoping she'd come around. Sarah knew it bugged me. She'd say, "Give her time." And I'd nod, even though I wasn't sure time would fix anything. I kept her old room ready, just in case. Dumb, maybe, but it was all I had left of her. And my daughter was 16 when I made one last try. I'd heard from a mutual friend that she was doing okay, decent grades, into sports, living the high school life. I figured maybe she was old enough to talk, to understand things better. So I called her mom and asked if I could see her. Ex said it was fine, but it was up to her. I drove over to their place, a huge house in a gated neighborhood, courtesy of the new guy. Felt weird pulling up in my beat-up truck, but I swallowed it and knocked. She came to the door. Tall, blonde, looking more like her mom than me. She didn't smile, just stood there with her arms crossed. I asked if we could talk. She said sure, but we stayed on the porch, no invite inside. I kept it light at first, asked about school, her plans. She answered short and clipped, like she had somewhere else to be. Then I got to it. Told her I missed her, that I'd always be her dad, that I wanted to be part of her life. She didn't react much, just stared at the ground. I pushed a little, asked if she'd ever want to hang out, maybe meet her half-brothers. That's when she cut me off. She looked me straight in the eye and said she didn't want to see me. Not now, not ever. Said the other guy was her dad, always had been, and I was just someone she used to know. No anger, no tears, just flat and cold. I stood there, taking it, then nodded. Told her I'd respect that. Drove home in silence, hands tight on the wheel. After that, I stopped trying. No more cards, no more texts. Sarah saw how wrecked I was and didn't push me to talk about it. I threw myself into my boys instead, coaching their games, fixing their bikes. Kept busy so I wouldn't think about her. It worked mostly. But every now and then, I'd see a kid her age at the store or something, and it'd hit me all over again. She was gone for good. 10 years passed without a word from her. I was 46, settled into my life with Sarah and the boys. They were 8 and 7 now, full of energy, keeping us on our toes. Work was steady, house was paid off, things were good. I'd mostly made peace with losing my daughter. Didn't think about her every day anymore, just sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet. Then one afternoon, I'm fixing a shelf in the garage, and there's a knock at the front door. Sarah yells that she's got it, but I head inside anyway, wiping my hands on a rag. I see her through the screen door before Sarah even opens it. My daughter. 19 now, taller, hair shorter, but it's her. She's standing there, shifting her weight, looking nervous. Sarah glances at me, confused, and I tell her it's okay. I open the door, and before I can say anything, she steps forward and throws her arms around me. First hug in a decade. She's shaking, saying she needs help. I'm too stunned to move at first, but I let her in. She sits on the couch, picking at her nails. The boys are outside, so it's just us. She says she's sorry for showing up like this, but she's in a mess. College is starting soon, and she can't pay for it. I ask what's going on, and it spills out. The new guy, her dad, isn't rich anymore. Lost his business, racked up debt, and the big house is gone. Her mom's barely scraping by. She needs money, and she doesn't know where else to turn. I sit there, listening, trying to process it. She looks at me, eyes wet, and asks if I can help. I don't answer right away. Part of me wants to say no, to tell her she made her choice years ago. But she's my kid, even after everything. I tell her I'll think about it, and call her mom to figure out what's real. She nods, says she'll wait. I watch her leave, and it's like a ghost just walked out of my house. After she left, I sat in the living room for a while, just staring at the wall. Sarah came in, asked who that was. I told her it was my daughter, and she went quiet. She knew the whole story, but seeing it in person was different. She asked what I was going to do. I said I didn't know yet, but I needed to talk to her mom first. Sarah nodded, squeezed my shoulder, and left me to it. I picked up the phone and dialed my ex's number. First time we'd spoken in years. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was tired, older than I remembered. I skipped the small talk and asked what was going on. She didn't dodge it. Said the guy she left me for had been living beyond his means for years, fancy cars, vacations, all on credit. Then his business tanked, and the bills caught up. They lost the house last year, moved into a small apartment. She was working 2 jobs now, barely keeping up with the debt. My daughter was telling the truth about college. She'd gotten into a decent school, but there was no money for it. Ex said she told her to ask me because I was her last shot. I asked why my daughter didn't call first, why she just showed up. Ex said she didn't know, but she figured the kid was too ashamed to face me over the phone after all this time. I asked if the guy was still around. She said yeah, but he's a mess, drinks too much, doesn't work. I didn't feel bad for her, not after everything, but I could hear how rough it was. She didn't ask me for anything directly, just laid it out and let me decide. I said I'd think it over and hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. Kept running it through my head, my daughter hugging me, asking for help, after a decade of nothing. Part of me was mad she only came back because she needed something. But another part couldn't shake the image of her on my couch, scared and desperate. I had the money. Not a ton, but enough to cover her tuition if I cut some corners. Question was, did I want to? I decided to help her. Took a few days to think it over, talked it out with Sarah. She didn't push me either way, just said she'd back whatever I chose. I kept going back to how my daughter looked on that couch, small, lost, like the kid I used to know. I couldn't turn her away, even if she'd turned me away years ago. So I called her up, told her to come back over. She showed up the next day, same nervous energy, sat in the same spot. I told her I'd pay for her first year of college. Gave her the number, enough for tuition and books, nothing extra. Her face lit up, and she thanked me over and over. Said she'd make it up to me, that she'd do better this time. I didn't say much, just handed her the check and told her to use it right. She hugged me again before she left, longer this time. I watched her drive off, feeling lighter than I expected. Figured maybe this was a start, a way back in. A month later I checked in. Called her, asked how school was going. She said it was fine, classes were good, but she sounded off. I asked if the money was holding up. She hesitated, then admitted she hadn't paid tuition yet. Said she'd used it for other stuff, a car, some clothes, a trip with friends. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling the anger build. She swore she'd fix it, that she'd pay me back, but I could hear the panic in her voice. She knew she'd screwed up. I didn't yell. Told her I wasn't giving her more unless I handled it myself. She didn't argue. I drove to her place the next week, met her at the apartment she shared with her mom. Paid the tuition directly to the school, set up a small account for books and basics. She didn't get a say in it. She thanked me again, quieter this time, and I left without much talk. Felt more like a transaction than a reunion. After that, I took control. No more handing her cash and hoping for the best. I set up a system. Money went straight to the school for tuition, and I gave her a debit card for essentials. Told her I'd check the statements every month. She didn't like it at first, said it felt like I didn't trust her. I told her she was right, I didn't. Not after she blew the first check on a car and a vacation. She stopped arguing after that. Guess she figured it was this or nothing. She stuck to it, mostly. I'd get the statements, see charges for groceries, gas, a coffee shop near campus. Nothing crazy. Called her every couple weeks to check in. She'd tell me about her classes, psychology major, decent grades, and I'd listen, ask questions. She started opening up a little, mentioning a professor she liked or a test she aced. It wasn't deep, but it was something. First real talks we'd had since she was a kid. I kept my end simple, made sure the bills were paid, didn't push for more. Her mom called once, thanked me for stepping in. Said my daughter was doing better than she expected, staying out of trouble. I asked about the guy she'd left me for. Ex said he was still around, still useless. I didn't press it. Didn't care enough to. My focus was on the kid. She finished her first year without failing anything, which I took as a win. Sent her a text saying I was proud. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. Small, but it was progress. Sarah noticed I was less tense about it. Said it looked like I'd found a balance. She was right. I wasn't chasing some big reconciliation anymore, just keeping her on track, doing what I could. The boys met her once when she stopped by. Called her their big sister, and showed her their Lego sets. She smiled, played along for a bit. I watched from the kitchen, not saying much. Felt strange having her there, but not bad. It's been 3 years since she showed up at my door. She's 22 now, in her last year of college. I've kept the money flowing, tuition, books, basics, all on my terms. She's stuck to the rules, hasn't pulled any stunts like that first time. Grades are solid, and she's talking about grad school. Calls me every month or so, updates me on her life. Nothing emotional, just facts, classes, internships, plans. I don't push for more. This is what we've got, and I'm okay with it. She's met the boys a handful of times. They like her, think it's cool having a sister who shows up with candy. Sarah's warmed up to her too, though she keeps her distance. My ex checks in once in a while, says the kid's doing better than she ever did with that guy. He's still around, still a wreck, but that's not my problem. I don't talk to him, don't care to. My daughter doesn't call him Dad anymore, at least not to me. She uses his first name now. Don't know what that means, but I don't ask. I think about the 10 years she ignored me a lot. Hurts less now, but it's still there. She only came back when she needed something, and that's a fact I can't shake. But I've got my boys, Sarah, a life that works. Helping her doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't make us close. It's just what I can do. She graduates next spring, and I'll be there, probably in the back row. She hasn't asked me to, but I'll go anyway. Looking back, I don't regret taking her in that day. Could have said no, could have held the grudge, but I didn't. She's not the kid I lost, and I'm not the dad she ditched. We're something else now, functional, distant, tied by cash and a thin thread of effort. It's not the ending I pictured, but it's mine. And for now, that's enough.